You are a self-proclaimed former crazy street preacher.
Yes.
Hello and welcome to this podcast conversation of the Epic Kate Show. I want to say a little disclaimer. I don't want to imply that everyone who has done street preaching or is currently doing street preaching is crazy. This is his story. This is John's story, and I'm really thankful for him to come on and share it, to talk about what led him to reevaluate his theology, what helped him to ask those questions that really need to be asked. The reason I share these conversations is because I want to help make the world a better place. I want to help people share their stories, share their growth. It's a great place for me to process my own inner struggles and questions and doubts and fears. That's why I do this, and I hope you will stick around for it. Please subscribe if this sounds good to you. It was a longer conversation. I really tried to cut it down to the best parts while still making it cohesive. So I really appreciate you listening and being here. Go ahead and like this video before you forget. I want to see a bunch of likes over here. Bunches of them. Give me that dopamine.
One of the things that I did, about 10, 12 years ago now, I would stand on the corner of a street. New York City was primarily where we operated out of. I had this giant paint board, and I would sketch gospel messages on it. We would tell people how they can get saved and things like that. Tell people if they don't know Jesus, they're going to hell. That sort of. I tried to avoid. Even then, I tried to avoid mentioning hell, but I still would yell at people and preach Bible verses at them, and it's quite strange thinking back on it. But yes, I was one of those. It wasn't quite sandwich sign and the world is ending, but it was pretty close. One of the questions I would always be asked was, if somebody came to you saying they had 5 seconds to live, and they said, "How do I get to heaven?" What would you say? It's such a loaded question. But it's funny because when or you talk about things like, well, the rapture's coming, the end times are near, these sorts of things, the time is short. You have to convert as many people as possible. There's only one passage in Scripture where Jesus talks about the end times, and he talks about he's standing at the gates of heaven and he has the book of life in his hands. And again, I don't know how much I believe this literally, but I like this story because I kind of gets the point across of who the Jesus I believe is. And he says, hey, Jesus says, why should I let you in? Essentially, is the question he asks. And he goes, well, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you cared for me. When I was in prison, you visited me. And he gives a list of these things. And they go, well, when did we see you like this, Jesus? And Jesus goes, well, whenever you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Welcome. And he says to the other group, why you're not welcome here. He goes, well, why not, Jesus? He goes, because when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was, naked, you didn't clothe me. Same list. But they did the opposite. And whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. That's, I think, a healthy church. It's a group of people who don't necessarily all agree on the nitpicky theology things, but they care for each other in their community. They realize nobody's perfect, and there's a space for people to grow, to laugh, to cry, it's digging into the teachings of Jesus.
And when we talked earlier, I was really interested to hear more about the methods and the theology and how it was emotionally manipulative for you to get into becoming that.
Yeah. If you don't mind, though, I think it's important to understand kind of a little bit of my background as far as like how I got involved in this in the first place, if that's okay. So my parents, I grew up Pentecostal. My parents are more, if you think Baptist, that's kind of all in the same vein of sorts. My grandparents were Southern Baptist. But But yeah, so, pretty standard American evangelical childhood. I went to Sunday school. I knew all the verses. I would go to church. It's right around year, 2001, my parents decided to homeschool me. Anybody familiar with kind of the American right-wing evangelical movement? There's kind of this culture war thing where, public schools aren't good. They're indoctrinating your kids. They are atheists. They don't teach the Bible in school. I think a lot of that had to play with why my parents started to homeschool. But that being said, I ended up losing my entire circle of friends that I had. And I was going into middle school, and that was kind of hard on me because I didn't have that many friends anyway, because we actually had just recently moved a couple years before. So in the space of 4 years, I lost my entire circle of friends twice. And that happens when you're a kid. But when I was homeschooled, that was really hard on me. The only other kid who lived on my street, and where my parents live, is a very rural farm area. So it's dirt roads. There's not many houses on the street. It was a friend of mine, JC. He was the same age as me. And he's an important part as to kind of how I get involved. But he quickly becomes, my best friend. He's homeschooled just like me. We have a lot of the same interests. I mean, we love Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and all sorts of things. But he would be gone a lot of the summer. And I never understood why at first. But, you're thinking, oh, summertime off, I get to hang out with my friends. Nah, he was always gone. And finally, I asked him about it, and he goes, oh, yeah, my dad's a preacher, and we do a lot of ministry. Turns out his dad is the one running this church that was doing the crazy street preaching. But I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. At the time, I was really just bummed out because I'm like, man, I don't get to spend time with my best friend. Right, exactly. As I, moved into high school and things like that, I was kind of an awkward kind of kid. I was lonely. I asked my friend JC, this was the year I would have graduated high school. I said, so, what do you guys exactly do in the summertime? And he goes, why don't you come along with us? So I went on the trip with them, and they kind of taught me the ins and outs of how to be a street preacher. There's a lot of practical things that I still use, like how to draw a crowd. Actually, I have a fear of public speaking a little bit, but I've kind of gotten over that. But a lot of it was the theology. Basically, it's pretty standard American evangelical Christianity stuff where, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. But the emphasis was always on, we have to tell these people right away. You have to do this, and it's so important. And eternal life is all that matters. And we can kind of dig into that as we go along a little bit. But one of the things that happened was I went on this 2-week trip, and I found out as I was interacting with people how much I didn't know about theology and how much I didn't interact with people all that well. So I actually enrolled they had a school. I enrolled in their school. I did that for 2 years. I joined their church. I jumped in feet first, and it turns out to be a cult. Looking back on it now, I would say the term cult also has a lot of loaded meaning to it. It wasn't like a Jim Jones, everybody's drinking the Kool-Aid. But at the same time, cults can be emotionally manipulative and controlling. There's a lot of different aspects. It doesn't have to be physically abusive. This was very much the leader of the group, the church, was Chris, and he's the number one guy. You don't contradict him. You don't question him. If you don't follow his theology exactly. One of the key phrases is they said they're a literal Bible believing church. It's a New Testament church where they take like the writings of Paul and actually literally interpret them as that's exactly what he means. They call themselves the Brethren. They don't believe in pastors, but a group of elders, which is kind of strange because Chris kind of did run the whole show anyway. But there's a lot of involved in that. But that's kind of how I got involved in that. And I think this is an aspect of cults, is that I was a lonely homeschooled kid. I didn't have that much of a future. My parents weren't exactly rich, so I didn't have money for college. They said they'd pay for everything, or at least a lot cheaper than, traditional education. And part of it was, well, you don't need traditional education. We'll teach you everything you need to know for your life. Right. Yeah. So you can see how I kind of got sucked into that. But yes, I definitely was a crazy street preacher. And there's a little bit, that's kind of how I got involved into down that rabbit hole.
Did you want to go into any more detail about the cult-like aspects of things, of like how a healthy church functions versus how this church functions?
Oh yeah, sure. A healthy church, in my mind, the way I see Jesus, as I see Scripture now, is the person who the feast is prepared and there's no guests at the table, and he says, "Well, go invite, the townspeople," and they all say they're busy, and then go invite, the next town over, or we can't come. And so we'll go out into the highways and byways of life that my table may be filled. I forget the exact reference for that passage, but you get the idea. Especially when you're talking about, because currently on United Church of Christ, we have an open communion table. And that's one of the things that, again, communion is one of those things that is going to be, every tradition does it differently. So I'm not knocking any other tradition. But in my mind, you have to at least have the spirit of welcoming, and I mean genuinely welcoming people with questions and difficulties. But also you have to say, if somebody doesn't believe what you believe, it's okay for them to have doubts and questions, and have room and space to have questions. Because when you talk about anything like faith or events that happened 2,000 years ago, there's going to be questions, there's going to be doubts, there's going to be room for growth. There's going to be people who don't believe the same way as you. One of the great people that I miss her so much, I never actually met her in person, but Rachel Held Evans, her writings, Searching for Sunday, fantastic book. If anybody wants to do a deep dive into that, that's a great place to start. It talks more about her journey. A lot of similarities in the same way of like the doubts and the questions. I don't necessarily even believe that a lot of the things in the Bible actually happened. But I believe that Jesus is a real person. Obviously, I do believe that he did die on the cross, that sort of thing. The fundamental tenets of it. But there are moments when I find myself even in questioning those, but I think that's okay. Because at the end of the day, as long as you're following the spirit that Jesus, he's a homeless, brown-skinned man from the Middle East who was an immigrant. Go down the list. He's exactly what American evangelical prosperity gospel isn't. So, with that in mind, the unhealthy kind of version of church, a lot of it was, if you had questions about theology, they had to be in a very structured, kind of addressed in a formal way. If you didn't strictly adhere to the rules, it's all a little bit convoluted. But if you maybe didn't have I didn't go through this, but I know some people who did, you have sex outside of marriage or something. Well, now you can't be a leader in the church. Okay, well, that's, there's a lot of things that they're very controlling about your life. One good example, I remember me and my brother, we used to go to Bible studies during the weeknights once a week. And we would we'd known these people for 5-6 years or more at this point. We'd been to their house a bunch. Lovely people. It was husband and wife, and they had 2 sons and a daughter. And this is important for the story because my brother went over there. This is wintertime, so it was cold and dark. He showed up before me at their house, and he knocked on the door thinking, oh, I'm going to go right on in and just start visiting. The husband wasn't home, and neither were the 2 sons. And it was just the mom and the daughter. And the mom said, oh, you can't come in. And my brother's like, that's weird. Why can't you come in? Go, because there's no guys in the house. What? So he literally had to wait in the car for 25 minutes. I mean, he had his car running, so he had heat, but it was still cold. And until the husband came home because you can't have a relation, you can't be in the same room, a guy and a girl in the same room alone. It's a weird, dumb rule, but it's actually, it's interestingly, it's Mike Pence follows this rule, or I would think he still does, but the former vice president, that was one of the weird aspects, is that if you have a meeting with him and you're a female, you have to either have another female or another guy in the room. It can't be just a guy-girl interaction.
That is just so dehumanizing to women that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So now you kind of get the idea of the kind of controlling aspect of it, where it's never quite like rude or mean. It's always, if you violate the rules, we're just going to turn a cold shoulder to you.
I want to hear about how it feels to have this burden of, if you don't tell people about Jesus, they're going to hell and their blood is on your hands.
Yeah, it's a weird headspace to be in. this is going to sound weird. I always felt guilty that I didn't feel more emotional about it.
Oh yeah, I can
associate
with that. I grew up with that.
Yeah. Because you see the people on TV and like they're crying tears, like especially like the televangelists, and like you're like, well, I think even then I had doubts about it, which is fair, which most people do. But it's like I never quite fully bought into it completely. I'm like, do I really have to be this emotional about it? Like this is I understand it sort of on a, like, I agree to the principles that you're laying out in like a mathematical formula, but I don't know if I actually completely agree with it. And I couldn't put my finger on why. Even today, I still can't quite, looking back on it, because it's bad. Like I think it's God and the Holy Spirit going, hey, listen, this is not kosher, so to speak. It's not good. This is not what I want. This is not that nagging kind of, even reading through scripture, it's like, well, this doesn't quite add up. But anyway, at the time, especially, I didn't know what that was, but it's such a, I think what it, again, it's kind of a hard feeling to describe unless you've actually been there, but it does kind of give you the sense of like, you feel guilty for doing ordinary things that aren't specifically gospel related. The point of that is to control you. Now, I know that now, but one of the weirder rules was I couldn't, not that I was I still can't quite dance. I'm not that quite rhythmically gifted, but you couldn't go out to dances and you couldn't do certain things. If you were out on a Friday night and not reading your, going to Bible study. My friend Jordan, he likes the club Tottenham Hotspur, and they were playing on a Sunday morning, and it was like 7 or 8 in the morning, and he was actually watching the game before church. Now, my friend Jordan still goes to church. He doesn't skip going to church for watching soccer, but he was trying to find out, at least catch the first half before he heard the Sunday sermon. And our mutual friend was like, "Oh, you're watching TV?" He's like, yeah, exactly. Well, shouldn't you be reading and praying and getting ready for church? He's like, well, that's kind of like why I'm going to church. He's like, well, what do you guys have the TV on a Sunday morning? Isn't Sunday for time of prayer? And it's like, bro, it's soccer. It's not like we're watching a horror film or something. But even then, if you did that, that's like, it's that level of control.
But I totally hear you, and I totally resonate with the feelings of guilt and shame that's continually on you when you're in this world of religion, that you're not caring enough about people's souls. You have to be doing this and this and this and this in order to be a good Christian. But so many of the things that you need to do and be in order to be a good Christian, you could very easily do without any heart in it at all. You can just go through the motions. You can show up. You can raise your hands. You can fake tears. Like, you can do everything. And people think, wow, what an amazing Christian they are. They're so in love with Jesus. Them and Jesus, they're just like this.
I think one of the better examples of that is you see that in the televangelism from the 80s. For people who are old enough to remember, I'm not quite, but I have studied it a little bit, and it's on YouTube. You can just look it up now. It's one of the pages of the internet. But my parents were part of the Praise the Lord network, if that's familiar to anybody. I mean, not directly, but they have a Praise the Lord Bible they had purchased at some point. But I mean, the Bakers, I had heard a story that their theme park in Tennessee, I believe it was, for the year 1985 was the most visited non-Disney theme park in the United States. I cannot think of the name of my Heritage USA, I think was the name of the park. But anyway, it was incredibly popular. But if you look at the way the Bakers turned out, I mean, Jim Bakker never got charged for anything, but there's strong evidence that he got involved in an affair with his staffers.
He only served a few years of his long sentence, and now he's back on the air, new wife,
yes.
selling buckets of food.
Yes, I was about to say, anybody who looks up Baker buckets, that's hours of entertainment. But the bigger point is that it makes you feel guilty again because it's getting you to conform to their ideals, shaping you to believe what they believe. Because if you were already in their club, they don't hold the people to the same standards. If you have power and wealth, you're not held to that same standard that the people at the bottom trying to get into this group are. A glaring example is Donald Trump. But you'll see this time and time again with CEOs, people who get within the church who get either accused of some sort of, it doesn't have to be anything sexual, even tax fraud or whatever, or willing to forgive them because he's such a good person. Well, he has power and money. And it's more of getting to control people through their theology rather than actually loving or caring about people. And that's what it comes down to. And honestly, a lot of these things that they use are carnival tricks, I want to call them. They're not quite. Like, it's the same idea that, for example, it's why casinos never put clocks on the wall, ever. If you go into a casino gaming floor, you will never know what time it is. You cannot see outside. And if there's a window to the outside, it's always tinted or very blacked out. Why? Because they've studied human psychology, and they know that if people lose track of time, they're more likely to stay and gamble. That sort of learning how people react to things and how to get to control people, like, nobody's actually telling you to sit down and go to a casino and forcing you to stay there. But it's this level of emotional manipulation that's baked in to everything they do at the casino. Now, listen, if the casino is your thing, I'm not judging, have a good time. But just know that that's what they're doing. It's the same kind of thing as to how worship services are structured. Look at how you'll sing the same song over and over and over. Repetition will it's kind of why contemporary Christian music kind of sounds the way it does. It all kinds of sounds the same, but it's designed to put you in a certain mood and put you in a certain state, make you feel certain things. That's how they control you. It's not even so much that they are, big brothers watching you and all. No, it's just they know what works, and through trial and error, the good churches have people stay. I say good in quotations, the ones that are good at manipulating, get people to stay, and the ones who aren't so successful can still have people come to their church, but and I'm specifically now referring to like the evangelical churches, the ones that believe this toxic theology. I think once you break through that and get down to a friendship and a fundamental level, and you break through that superficial Sunday stuff, you can have a growing, successful church, and it's part of the community and outreach, going back to, like Rachel Held Evans and things like that.
I wanted to give you the chance to talk about the moments that really led you to challenge the toxic theology and to ultimately be able to look away from it.
One of the first ones is a little bit strange. Me and my brother attended this church on a regular basis. My friend Jordan, there's a few of us that have left now that we were close. I kind of followed his theology, and I talked more to him than anybody in the church. And so he was kind of explained some of these things to me. Hey, this is messed up. This is whack. what do you think about this? So obviously everybody knows former American President Barack Obama. One of the controversies in the lead up to his 2008 election was his pastor. I'm not entirely sure what denomination or how religious President Obama is, but he's definitely familiar with the, church traditions and faith traditions. There was a church in Chicago by the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And I remember this name because I used to listen to a lot of talk radio, conservative talk radio. And one of the my dad loved him, my grandpa both my grandparents loved him. And Rush Limbaugh, that's the big name. Everybody knows him. I'm not sad to see him go. That's a whole other conversation. But the amount of toxic things that he said over the years. But one of the things that I remember he talked about was how Reverend Jeremiah Wright said, it's a direct quote, "Goddamn America." That's what he said. Now, if that's out of context, you're like, okay, that's a shocking thing. Why would anybody say this from the pulpit? What's the deal here? Obviously, Barack Obama is some sort of secret communist because his pastor hates America. And because your pastor said it, you automatically have to believe everything your pastor says, going back to this toxic theology, because you agree with your pastor, don't you? So if your pastor said this, would you ever stay at that church? But he stayed at this. It's a whole. Okay. So obviously, it didn't hurt his election chances. He became president and won a re-election. But my brother actually sent me the full link to that sermon, or at least the context. And that was one of the first moments where I was like, well, wait a minute. Because if you listen to that clip of his sermon, I don't, like the first 20 minutes before he says this, it's a regular sermon. Like, I don't see anything objectionable in this. He's talking about scripture. He's talking about how, don't put your trust in men, put your trust in God. That's reasonable. I've heard that every Sunday. God doesn't like it when we sin. Again, heard that every Sunday. But what Reverend Wright did was he applied it to America as a whole, as a nation, instead of an individual. And when he did that, he was talking about, again, I don't remember the specific, but he was talking about basically the sins that America has committed over the years. And he more or less said that, America's chickens are coming home to roost. And, goddamn America, it's in the Bible. That's one of the quotes, it's the famous that he said that. But when you look at it at a deeper level, looking back on it now, he's not. Should he have said damn no, if he wanted to reach a specific group of people, he probably shouldn't have said that. I have no problem with cussing. I will try to keep this conversation as clean as I can. I'm not a fan of it, but listen, if you've got I have no issue with people swearing, cussing. It doesn't matter to me at all. But, okay, good. But when you even, something I've been studying recently is looking back at when I was a kid, I didn't understand it, but the Iraq War. If you look at from about 1990 to 2005, it's estimated that America, as a direct action, either through the sanctions of the 90s under Clinton or through Bush and the invasion, 500,000 to 1 million Iraqis are dead directly because of American involvement. Yeah. So, and that's another topic, though, once you start digging into that, you realize how messed up that is. So that was one key moment where I kind of peeled back the curtain and went, what is he talking about? What's the bigger context? Also got me on a rabbit trail of why is there a black church and a white church in America? That's a whole other conversation. But once you start digging into that, you start learning about Dr. King. Great Christian people. I mean, Bayard Rustin is another great person. If you don't know who that is, he's a civil rights icon. You look him up.
Another person that you said made an impact on you towards changing your heart was a person named Philando Castile.
He worked in the schools in, I believe it was Milwaukee. By all accounts, was a upstanding citizen, a good person. He got pulled over by police It was him, his fiance, and their young son, I believe it was, in the back of the car. This would have been July of 2016, if memory serves me correctly. And when the police pulled him over, he told the police officer that he had a concealed weapons permit. He was a member of the NRA, but he was a black man. And the police officer felt threatened and fired, I don't know how many rounds, 8 or 9 rounds into the car right in front of his fiance and their son. The entire time, his fiance was still calling the police officer sir and acting calm. I mean, I'll never forget what late night host Trevor Noah said. He said, in that moment, the police officer may have forgot his training, but Philando Castile's fiance didn't forget her training, that you still have to be respectful to police officers, which is unbelievable that she had that mental fortitude. So anyway, I began asking, this was obviously the big topic of discussion around the coffee hours and things like that at church. And I kept thinking, well, this guy's a member of the NRA, which the NRA is very much revered, almost as the New Testament is revered in conservative circles. Guns it's a whole thing. But I questioned it. I said, why did things like this happen? Why do we insist on supporting police, things like that? And I think I asked valid questions, because I don't think that anything like that should happen. We see the Ferguson, whether it's Ferguson or 2015, going back to Trayvon Martin, I believe in 2012, there's these incidents that work their way into the conservative zeitgeist, I guess is the right word, to where they'll be mentioned on Sunday mornings, which is strange to me, because I don't understand how you can, you see like the story of the Good Samaritan. How can you say anything other than feel sympathy for the people who died? But again, it goes back to, because it's this idea of control and power, if you step out of line far enough and you get shot, you deserved it. You had it coming. That mentality never quite applied to me, because I have the right amount of melanin in my skin. But it's true. If you look at Black people who try to in these conservative circles and try to fit in, you have to adhere to this white evangelicalism to a T. I never quite realized how strong that overlap was until that moment, when it starts to bleed over to, well, now you're not a good Christian if you don't, if you're not supporting the police. Well, how does that have to do with anything? They'll quote like, they'll throw like Romans at you. I believe it's Romans chapter 14, and you have to, obey the law enforcement. But they don't mention that a couple verses down the line it says, well, love your neighbor. Like, they'll ignore that, and it's, again, that's just more of a questioning of, I've seen the way the world really worked, and you see the way things happen, and it's not, unless you stay in that bubble, which is incredibly hard and incredibly isolating and incredibly lonely and incredibly stressful, because again, you feel that guilt all the time. But you don't, the only time you ever interact with people outside that bubble is being crazy street preacher. When you have that conversation with people outside of that bubble that's not gospel related, all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, there's some messed up things in this world, and that shouldn't be part of it. Again, I don't know exactly to what extent, as far as theology goes, Philando Castile changed me. But it kind of opened my eyes to understand that a lot of the fundamental tenets aren't even really theologically based, but more of a, this is how we do things, this is what it's supposed to be, this is what it's supposed to look like. And if you don't look the right way, even in skin color, but it can be the way you dress, you see this with, police in women's attire. That's a whole other, down the line. But it's the same sort of thing. If you don't conform to their ideal, you are being sinful and you are out of line. Trayvon Martin got what he deserved because he was wearing a hoodie or something. It's all these crazy, goofy things that are like, again, you can't, if you walk into an American evangelical church that you've never been to before, they won't tell you these things. But that's the point. It's not, they lure you into this culture. And once you start seeing things for how they really are, or they figure out, if they figure out that you're not part of it, you're not willing to be, conform to that, you'll get the cold shoulder treatment. I haven't talked to people for 3-4 years now that I was good friends with, and I had to cut off all contact with them. But that's another. But yeah, that's kind of how Philando Castile fits in all of this. And his story is the most egregious in my mind that I can remember. I mean, obviously there's a lot more. George Floyd, for some people, it was that.
For me, it was the Capitol attack. That it was so clearly Trump's people. It was so clearly, and they refused to accept that. And they were tourists, and they were just doing a peaceful demonstration. Like, there's footage up the wazoo of how clear it was, and how if it would have been a bunch of Black people going in there, guns blazing, flags twisting, the ground would have been littered with bodies. But they're privileged white people who walked right back out of there. And I just want the entire book just thrown at them. The full freaking
I agree.
Of the law.
I absolutely agree. One of the things that you don't necessarily see in news, I mean, it's there if you look, because maybe the photos aren't dramatic enough, but it's amazing to me the amount of the Christian flags that you see in the background of some of these photos. If you've ever looked, you will find them. You know what I'm talking, the white flag with the blue corner and the red cross. One would be too much, but it's amazing to me that there was still people flying those flags on top of the Trump flags and the Confederate flags and whatever other, But this does go back to what kind of tying into going back in the day. I mean, you had guys who were Baptist ministers and preachers in the 30s and 40s who were active members of the Klan. And somehow, I mean, there's a fantastic photo, not fantastic in a good way, but it's so illuminating. There's if you can find the photo, it's not hard to find. Google Klansmen in church, and it's a picture of a typical Southern Baptist church, and above the altar, or whatever you call it, above where the pulpit is, it says Jesus saves on the wall. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen that going into Baptist churches or whatever. But they have a photo lined up in the front. Everybody's wearing Klan robes. There's probably 30, 40 people. Yeah, but that's just it. It's part of the isolation in the bubble is to get people to distance themselves from reality. That's part of the manipulation and the control. Is homeschooling is isolating on purpose. We can control what you learn, because we don't have to tell you about the founding of America, that when they say, all men are created equal, well, if Black people only count as, 3/4 or 2/3 of a person, that's, that doesn't apply to them, that sort of thing.
I read recently that slavery was written into the 13th Amendment.
Yes, if you look at the 13th Amendment, it's an abolition of slavery except as a punishment for crime. This is why you can still get away with, you talk about current events, the wildfires. I believe California changed the law recently, but there are certain places where convicts can fight fires for the state and only paid like 5 cents an hour or something ridiculous. Then when they leave prison, they can't, because they have a criminal background, they can't be a firefighter, even though that's maybe what they've done for the last 3 or 4 years. The fire houses cannot hire them to fight fires once they're released from prison because they have a criminal background. So But this is kind of ties into, again, a good church looks at these things and says, people are hurting. And again, I don't necessarily how much I believe in heaven or hell anymore. As a literal, especially hell as a literal place, I can't believe in that anymore. But you talk about how you get into heaven, and Jesus is the one who talked about it. And one of the famous phrases in my mind that got stuck to me, infamous, was we believe the Bible is the Supreme Court from which there is no appeal. Well, okay, if you really do believe that, that's what Jesus said. I can't think of anybody else who would be, in your mind, in a greater person of influence than God himself. If you really believe that Jesus is God and he walked among us, and that's what he said, I have no reason to question that. If that's, again, this is playing into their hand and playing into their, but they don't believe that. Otherwise, they'd behave differently.
What's encouraging to me is talking to people like you who have been at one end of the spectrum and have continued to believe in God and hold on to faith in spite of the torrid history around us.
And that's why I think that reading Rachel Held Evans was so inspirational. There's another great book, Unraptured, by an author named Zach Hunt.
I got to have Zach Hunt on this channel.
I must have missed. I was looking through your library videos. I must have missed that one. But yes, his story is great. I will have to go back and check that out. But it's people like him who show you that it's crazy. Yeah. But there's a brighter way forward. There was a period of time where I couldn't go to church. And this is one thing that if anybody's watching this, and I think it's okay to not go to church. That's one of the things that they beat into your head, is that if you skip going to church, you're somehow heathen or a sinner. I cannot tell you how many. I found more people with more faith. I found other faiths that have a deep tradition. When I left the church and I walked away and I said, I'm going to reclaim my Sunday mornings. Part of that was was working midnight, so it wasn't that difficult for me, because I said I was sleeping in and everybody bought that excuse. But really, it was because you have toxic people who, you can sit on the pulpit on Sunday morning and tell me if I vote for Hillary Clinton, I'm going to hell. But at the same time, I'm not a good Christian and I'm not a good fisher of men if I don't vote for Donald Trump. Tell me where that says that in the Bible. It doesn't. That's the other seminal moment for me, was it was this light bulb going off, where it's like they had a guest preacher and he said that from the pulpit. And I went, if you said the same thing about any other candidate, but because he has an R next to his name instead of a D, I believe it was James Baldwin who said, ignorance allied with power is the most dangerous enemy humanity can have. And I might be getting that quote wrong, but the idea that ignorance and power, the ignorance is on purpose because they don't want to believe anything else, because it's that ignorant theology. And I don't mean ignorant as stupid. Don't get me wrong. These are very smart people, but it's intentionally ignoring. That's the ignorant I'm going for here in that sense, is that it doesn't call back certain points of your history. It ignores certain groups of people. It ignores the needs of people just so you can maintain your position of power and privilege. Jesus, he went up to the money changers and he flipped tables. Why? Because he felt like getting a workout and he needed he needed a bicep workout? No. You can't love God unless you see God in all of humanity. You can't love humanity unless you see God in all of humanity. There's a direct one-to-one relationship there, where if you really do believe, and I'm not a creationist anymore, but if you do believe that people are made in the image of God, which I do believe that every human being, at least at some point in their life, has that divine spark. And when you see that as everybody, and not exclusively America, not exclusively white people, not exclusively rich people. Whatever category you put others and divide them up into, the more you get involved in helping and building a community that's around you, regardless of who they voted for, regardless of what they look like. I think this does apply to some of the people who, I have family members that supported like the Capitol on the 6th of January of this year, the riots. I still will try to love them because maybe they weren't there, maybe they weren't involved. It's different if you have people who are leaderships or higher up, but just maybe they have different views and maybe but you still got to love them anyway, because that's how you're going to win them over. You're not going to win them over by being the same as them. You can't exclude them. Don't stoop to their level. Don't play their games. The way you leave is trusting your instincts. When something feels off, it probably is, and never stop asking questions. If you feel like something's wrong, question it, challenge it. If you challenge somebody's authority who really is a good leader, they will be able to welcome and respect your opinion and validate your opinion and tell you if you're right or wrong. Not just tell you you're wrong and here's why and now shut up and go away. Don't question me anymore. That's not a good leader. A good leader will bring you alongside, and if they don't know, they'll find the answer with you. Maybe there is no good answer, but that's the point, is that you got to find these people in your life who bring you joy, and listen to the people around you who really do have your best interest in mind. Not to say my parents didn't. I think my parents did when they were trying to steer me away from the cult in the first place back when I was in high school. And again, it's not to fault my parents. It's not to fault anybody. It's one of their last thing is just life happens. Your circumstances, don't blame circumstances or things that happen that you can't control anymore. What happened in the past is past. I'm not saying you can't feel that and embrace it and come to grips with it and wrestle with it, but don't let that define you moving forward. I think that's a huge part of because I still stumble and I still feel these things and I still go back and I find myself, in some of these behaviors sometimes, or just, habits that kick in because I was in it for so long of feeling guilty or feeling bad. But life happens. I don't think that everything happens for a reason. Some things just happen. You roll with it, and if you have a good community around you supporting you, that's how you move forward. And hopefully everybody can find that community and get in touch with homeless Jesus.
The way that I finish my conversations is I give hugs.
Oh. Thank you. I appreciate it.